So you've got to be aware that often a hypermobile individual will want or need, and I almost say that in inverted commas, to have that feeling of stretch because that gives them feedback. And that is a difficulty because stretch is not really something we want in many areas or elements of our bike setup.
Welcome to Cycling Demystified, brought to you by Foundation Bike Fit and Frequency Cycle Works, the podcast where we help you take your cycling to the next level by sharing the knowledge from experienced bike fitters, mechanics, and the hidden players within the bike industry.
Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. And today we have a very special guest on the show. We have Bryan McCullough from the Bike the Body. Welcome to the show, Bryan. Woohoo!
Thanks for having me. The third place physio on the podcast.
Third place physio, and probably the third time we've tried to do this podcast.
Yeah. True, it is. Yes, let's admit the fact that there was a lot of
some technical issues.
Technical issues,
yes. But we're here, and we're going to talk about hypermobility today. And I think I wanted to get you on specifically just because you have a clinical background. You are a physio, you are trained, you have the rubber stamp, but you're also a bike fitter, so you understand the context in which we're operating. And maybe selfishly, this is something I've been seeing quite a bit in the studio, so I've been really curious to dig into it a little bit more and understand a little bit more. Of course, as a bike fitter, I can see what I can see. I can see the observations. I can kind of see the results, but I don't necessarily understand fully what is going on within the body and maybe the extent to which this has an effect on both our mobility and our bike riding at the end of the day. That's what we're here to discuss. So yeah, we're going to talk about hypermobility, what it is, why it matters, and what we can do about it. If we want to do anything about it, that is. But before we get into all that lovely stuff, we should probably talk about you, Bryan. Who are you? What do you do?
Well, I feel like this is probably going to become a boring story for people who are listening to the podcast. It's like, oh, the third physio bike fitter. Like, okay, I know how this goes. So really briefly...
And you're GCN famous as well, aren't you?
Yeah, GCN infamous maybe, yeah, or was. So my background is physio. So I qualified, I was trying to count, like 18 years ago, I think. 19? Oh, anyway, about that. I qualified as physio, went to all junior rotations, did all my experience that way, which most do, you don't have to, but did my hospital rotations, quickly worked out that I wanted to do what I thought I wanted to do, which was musculoskeletal physio. So working on the body and injuries and rehab, that side of things. That then took me to Bermuda, of all places, where I worked in a sports physio clinic. And that was really where things changed. I got sucked into the world of triathlon, the fun world of triathlon. And as a result of that, I started to work with lots of the triathletes that were on the island, that were based there. And so they were coming to see me and we were helping lots of them. And in lots of cases, there just seemed to be something else going on that was holding them back. So I got hold of a turbo trainer from the local bike shop, stuck it into the clinic where I was working, and we started to look at people on the bike. At this point, it was just very unstructured. It was just, hey, what can I do to apply my knowledge and look at someone on the bike and see if there's something that we can figure out from there. But I found it fascinating and really interesting. And even at that stage, I could start to see the relevance of my knowledge in influencing how a bike could be set up. But at that point, I didn't know enough about bike fitting and performance and all of the other aspects. So, it was the true rabbit hole that bike fitting is. And I was super excited to get involved in that. So started to do more training and then brought that back to my clinical practice when I moved back to the UK. And I did my master's in sports medicine. And at that point was still deep in triathlon. So I did my research on triathlon injuries. So that kind of continued to cement that sort of interest area. And from there, then I was in clinical practice working in a sports medicine clinic. And the bike fit, because the way physio and sports med clinics operate, was very much on the side. We had a turbo trainer and some tools, but that was it. The opportunity for investment to build the service wasn't there. So you were sort of, hey, it's great to have this bike fit service, but we're not going to add any money to that. You just do what you want to do. So it was quite limited, but it was nonetheless fun and a great opportunity to learn. And I helped to co-host some conferences that we did with another colleague of mine, another physio bike fitter, Bryan, who used to work with Orica Green Edge, as they were back then. and Dan Gillamest as well. And so again, there was just opportunities to learn from other peers and build experience. Fast forwarding on, we left London. I was working in Bath. The pandemic arrives, fun for everybody. And I took it as an opportunity to change how I was set up instead of working in a physio clinic. And I said, I'm going to do what I want to do, which is to have a much more focused practice surrounding bike fit, rehab, and physio assessment and treatment. So then I set up the Bike the Body. We joked earlier about all these fancy names. I thought I should kind of, hey, some fancy cool name. And I just thought, just make it simple. It's the bike and the body. They are the two things we want to work with. Keep it simple. And I've been doing that now for 4 years, and it's been lots and lots of fun.
Yeah, you've got a beautiful studio out there. Are you, what are you, Bath side?
Yeah, 20 minutes outside of Bath. So just kind of back towards the London direction. It's never far. It's a 1 hour train ride back into London, if ever the need be. And obviously I was hoping to host you at the studio today, but sometimes technical and motoring glitches get in the way of that. But come out to the studio soon.
Yeah, the world has a way of letting you know. Good stuff. So let's get into what we're going to talk about today, which is all about some hypermobility. And maybe just to give you a bit of context about what I've been seeing in the studio. I've just been seeing a lot of riders who have trouble controlling their bodies on their bike, or not like both from an awareness point of view, but also just how they hold their joints in space on the bike. And that in particular has been affecting the way they pedal, how they feel on the bike, maybe without them realizing what this hypermobility, or they just don't really realize how it's been affecting them and how their movement has been affected on the bike. And particularly we'll see people riding with very locked out arms, maybe dropping heels a lot, hyperextending the knees, maybe some excessive movement around the hips and so on. And so there seems to be a huge variation in hypermobility and where it exhibits throughout the body. But a lot of it seems to be about control of movement and how that movement is then applied into some activity like cycling. So I wondered if we could go through just discussing what it is. From a high level, we can get a little bit nerdy into it if we need to get into the different segments of or degrees of hypermobility. And then we want to give people some context around why and how it affects our cycling, and then what we can do about it. So, sound good?
Well, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to unpack. We should probably try and start at the beginning, which I suppose is just understanding a little bit more about what the conditions are or aren't. And maybe the easiest way to open that door is to understand that we perhaps have joint hypermobility, which is not classified as a connective tissue disorder. And then we have all of the other sides of hypermobility that would be classified as a connective tissue disorder. So that's when we start to move more towards Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or EDS. When we move to the connective tissue disorder side, we have at least 13 different subcategorizations of hypermobility, the most common of which is hypermobile EDS, and that accounts for 90% of EDS. That actually doesn't have an understood sort of genetic underlying component, although it just hasn't been identified, but there is an underlying sort of genetic change that is leading to that. But ultimately what we're talking about with connective tissue disorders is something that's changed within the formation of connective tissue. So what is our connective tissue? The base of that is collagen fibers and the proteins that code and create those collagen fibers. And there is a change at some level of the protein coding of that collagen, and therefore how it's constructed. And as a result of that, there is a change in how that tissue behaves, how it's formed, its structural integrity, its sort of interlinking and function within the body. The important thing perhaps to be aware of, that I think most people are not aware of when we're sticking within connective tissue disorders, is just how widespread the effects of this can be. So connective tissue is not just our muscle, fascia, and tendons and ligaments, but joint capsule, blood vessels, the tissue surrounding our organs and our viscera, nerves, our skin. So it's a far-reaching set of potential effects that can exist within the various subcategories of hypermobility. So that's probably the first thing to be aware of. Then with just joint hypermobility, we can talk about localized joint hypermobility, where there might be one large joint that's affected, generalized joint hypermobility, which is the most common of what we'll see at multiple sites, and then peripheral joint hypermobility, which is kind of out in the smaller joints, and then historical joint hypermobility, where someone may have had it as an adolescent or a child and then have sort of grown out of it, which is the most common in cases that hypermobility gradually will tend towards reducing, unless it is one of those genetic EDS, connective tissue disorders. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
if we're dealing with a connective tissue disorder, the likelihood is that the majority of those symptoms will remain throughout the lifetime, though they will change. But if we're dealing with straight joint hypermobility, that will tend towards reducing as we age, so that we kind of subcategorize those different adolescence, young adult, and late adulthood for how much we might expect to see. And it's a gradually reducing trend. We all know that. We sadly get less flexible as we age.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes cause problems.
Yeah.
But coming back to that sort of side of EDS is just recognizing that it's a multi-systemic condition, not just MSK. And I think as first contact practitioners, which bike fitters often are, that's a term we use in physio a lot, where you are the first person that sees someone with a health complaint. That health complaint may not be the primary problem. The primary problem may be something else underlying. So it's great to try to be aware of these things so that we can identify, hey, I can help with this part, but you might need some further investigation. You may need to go and see a physio, or you may need to go back and see your GP. I think this could be at play. So that can massively help with the overall management of that case if there are other issues going on. So the sort of things you might ask are thinking about do they get any gut or digestive issues, which they may well voice up. If you do a good clinical history, you're going to ask those questions and find out a little bit more about that. Things like really obvious stretch marks where someone hasn't had significant gain or loss in weight is just because their tissue stretch is much higher, and they can develop those sort of what we would simply non-clinically term as a stretch mark. So sometimes you'll see those as well, and they can be just little clues, little hints that there could be a connective tissue disorder underlying what you see as the hypermobility side.
Yeah. And is there a particular reason why it's called or termed as a disorder rather than just, a thing? Or is it just the label that is put onto it as a...
I think that just exists. Truly, from the medical world, things are often called disorders, deformities. So certain bony prominences, for example, you may have heard of a Haglund's, which is a sort of more prominent bone at the back of the heel. That's called a Haglund's deformity. Not a great term to use because it kind of adds a little stigma to what is ultimately just an additional bony prominence. It's not a big problem. So yes, with this, the connective tissue disorder as a term, so CTDs, I think that is important because it is a disordered collagen formation function. Mm-hmm. So in that realm, it seems a reasonable moniker to add to it. But again, that is a subset of the hypermobility that we might see in the bike fit studio. Yeah. And joint hypermobility is not, I would classify, something that is a disorder. That is just someone whose connective tissue is at that far end of the tensile tolerance flexibility spectrum. And thus, those parts of the connective tissue in their musculoskeletal system, ligaments, tendons, joint capsule, and so forth, allow a greater range of motion. But also, to your question on their awareness, and this is, I think, probably what we'll want to dig into a little bit later on, is that change in the rider's proprioception or awareness. So because of the collagen structure is different, it almost has an altered sensitivity response process. So that spring or that tension that we feel in a joint, we are able to respond and know that we're towards end range, whether it's in someone with hypermobility or somewhere on the hypermobility spectrum, they will have a reduced sensitivity to that stretch response and therefore not be aware that they are approaching the joint's physiological or anatomical even range of motion, and therefore have that difficulty in being able to identify where that end of range is and therefore how to control within that.
Yeah, I wondered if that was an observation that we've made within the studio of how people operate with hypermobility. And because our bike fit process requires a lot of feedback from the rider and some proprioceptive feedback in terms of what they're feeling and how they're controlling their body. It's been interesting to see how some riders seem to have, it like a bit more trouble like figuring out kind of where their bodies are and how to control that, or just really we're going to having to get hands on to really kind of help them into certain positions. And it's been interesting how that kind of relates to hypermobility. So it kind of filtered into my head whether or not, are you hypermobile because you have a less proprioception, or is that proprioception or the less proprioception because you have
The
the
latter.
hypermobility?
Yeah, the altered proprioceptive awareness sensitivity, or what we might call that kinesthetic awareness, is a byproduct of that collagen structure being different. It has a lower threshold sensitivity response, thus it allows more movement around the joint. It does not feed back as quickly or as sensitively compared to somewhere further back on that flexibility spectrum. So when someone comes into the studio, what you want to think about are, what are your cues towards, should I ask more questions, and how should I actually assess this? To what extent am I dealing with hypermobility? I mean, maybe I'll throw the question back to you. What's the first thing that you either see or experience in a bike fit session that makes you think I could be dealing with an individual who is somewhere on this hypermobility spectrum?
Yeah, it's usually, well, we usually throw them onto the bike straight away and just
Okay.
watching them move. And usually it's probably the most common one is kind of bracing through the elbows. So people will tend to brace their upper bodies through the elbows, locking out their elbows, shoulders, and just whatever you do to the bike, however they change, you change their position, they'll try and keep that kind of position. If we take them off the bike, then we can get them to lock out their elbows without being attached to the bike, and quite often we'll see that the range of movement through that joint goes beyond, say, and on the elbow joint, like beyond the 180 degrees. So instead of being a straight elbow, then they'll go beyond that. And sometimes in knees as well, just in how they move, squatting, ankles, like just a lot of dorsiflexion through the ankles when they're squatting, like getting really low into their squat. And so then you start asking the question as well, is this joint range that they're just using to get through the movement, or is this a trained movement or something else like that? Does that kind of tally?
Yeah, so I suppose, unsurprisingly, being a physio, my bike fits still start with clinical screening and history taking. So I think that's interesting, because if we start with our detailed history, and the history involves the rider interview as well about what they want from their fit, which I'm sure we've all talked about before. But then there's like the medical clinical history that we'll ask, and that's interesting because you may well have someone who says, I was diagnosed with hypermobility. And then at that stage, there are levels to which that person may well be engaged. I've had quite a few clients. Last year, I was working with a lady who had all elements of a full connective tissue disorder. So she had HEDS, so hypermobile EDS, but she also had POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia, POTS. Yeah, that's a bit of a mouthful. POTS is essentially, it alludes to this change in the vascular structure, and that's obviously more so, vascular being all our blood vessels. So again, they are connective tissue structure, so they are affected by this connective tissue disorder. And what happens with POTS is this tachycardia is basically a very fast heartbeat. Postural is a change in your posture. Orthostatic is just changing from horizontal to upright. So this postural orthostatic tachycardia is a response by your heart because it realizes that the vasculature has not constricted adequately to maintain blood pressure and perfusion for your brain and your organs. And so suddenly the heart beats really quickly to make up for that. And that's your body's, it's if you have a connective tissue disorder that affects the vasculature, then this is a natural response that will happen. And you've got to be aware of that, because they can then obviously experience that lightheadedness, that dizziness associated with that. So this lady I was working with had hypermobile EDS, she had POTS, she also had MCAS, which is mast cell activation syndrome. So essentially what that is a very hyperactive inflammatory cellular response. So she used to develop hives quite easily, or from skin contact, she developed like red skin and raised skin. So again, the spectrum of disorders for her was really quite far reaching. So anyway, yeah, I bring that up just to show you that range of when I'm taking history, she was very engaged because she had suffered lots of problems. She had chronic pain with this as well, which is another really common thing with EDS, where they'll develop chronic pain around certain joints as well. So she was very engaged with the history. Others might not be. And you start to hear this, sort this joint, sort that joint. You're thinking, okay, could there be something more underlying? So that's that first part, is taking that history and seeing, have they got a lot of awareness, and have they been diagnosed with something in the past? And if so, have they had various investigations? Are there other associated problems? After that, you then might have your own questions to ask about, have they suffered from joint related problems? Have you had subluxations, so partial dislocations of joint, or complete dislocations? Have you suffered from repeated dislocations? That's another big hint that there's underlying joint hypermobility at play. So there's questions that you can start to ask that will help to get you in the right frame of mind for how you might be dealing with this rider going forward. The next thing I'll do is I'll get into my physical screening. And if I'm already thinking that there may well be some hypermobility at play, you're going to see someone standing. You might see some classic traits. You've already mentioned two of those. So hyperextending knees, so knees going beyond zero, so extending backwards, hyperextended, and the elbows hyperextending. So when we do a clinical exam, what we're essentially doing there is something called the Baton scale or the Beighton scale. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No.
So that's a clinical test that we will carry out so that we can score to some extent. So it's a 9-point scale, and that 9-point scale consists of knee hyperextension on both sides. So that would be 1, 2. Forward bend, reaching your hands flat to the floor with your knees straight. That would be 3. Lockout hyperextension on both elbows, 4, 5. Being able to touch your thumb back to your wrist on both sides, 6, 7. And then being able to bring your little finger back beyond 90 degrees, and that's 8, 9. So if they are able to do all of those things, that's 9 out of 9 on the Baton scale. That forms one part of a diagnostic criteria for hypermobility. If we're thinking of connective tissue disorders, because of all of the other elements. If we're thinking about just joint hypermobility, you can say at that point, if they score 9 out of 9, this person has joint hypermobility. And whether or not there are connective tissue disorders underlying is perhaps not for you to say. You may think that there are and suggest that they seek follow-up, or you may know that there is because they've brought that history. But either way, I suppose what you want to know in terms of for your bike fit session is, does this rider in front of me have joint hypermobility? And therefore, is that going to affect how we look at their movement patterns and how they can respond? So the Baton scale is something I would suggest that you carry out to give you a metric for that. And during our different stages of life, certain scores will be indicative of hypermobility. So in young adolescents, you have to score, I think, over a 7 or an 8. I think over a 7 if you're an adolescent. So pre-puberty. If you're within sort of that puberty age, so kind of teenagers, then over 6 is considered hypermobile. And I think then as an adult, over 5 is still considered hypermobile onto that spectrum. Anything less than that, so if someone just has 2 hyperextending knees, you would not classify that as overall joint hypermobility. They may have localized hypermobility, to say, at their knee joints. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. And as kind of parents, both of us with young children, we certainly observe our children every day, and just the amount of mobility that children have is always amazing. But you know, they're developing human beings. They literally don't have the connective tissues and strength that we as adults have, and so it's a really interesting observing what movement patterns they can get into.
Yeah.
But you were saying earlier how you can kind of grow out of hypermobility. Is there a time scale for that, or
so generally, as I said there, through that sort of pre-puberty, puberty, and then adulthood, that it's during those 3 phases that you will gradually relative hypermobility will reduce if it's not if there is not an underlying connective tissue disorder associated. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it's different for everybody. As I said, some people will have 9 out of 9. If we just use the Baton scale as our joint hypermobility sort of comparator, 9 out of 9. So all of those joints hypermobile. and they will stay that way all the way through into their adulthood. So if I see someone in their 40s and 50s and they've got a 9 out of 9, that means they have gone through their whole life staying hypermobile. For me, I'm thinking there's potentially a high choice that there is a connective tissue disorder underlying. So I would definitely be, if I have a 50-year-old in there for the first time and they score 9 out of 9, I am definitely going back and asking other questions that I know relate to potentially underlying connective tissue disorders. If you're not clinically trained or not as familiar, it's just enough to say, hey, you know what? There could be something underlying this that would be good to understand. Again, you don't want to scare the individual into thinking there's some sort of terrible syndrome, but you might be encouraging them to find out more and be able to better manage, because they might start to be able to join the dots between, hey, heck, actually I suffer with lots of joint pains and I never really thought about it. Nobody ever said it to me and I never thought to ask. So if you see someone at that age and they haven't had any assessment or diagnosis, and you get someone who is a 9 out of 9, I would probably be suggesting that they should be exploring a little bit more about whether there could be an underlying connective tissue disorder, something like hypermobile EDS or any of the other subcategories.
Yeah.
So that's an important one, I think, to know. But yes, you will. Otherwise, our general mobility will reduce, and most hypermobility will trend downwards as we go through puberty and post-puberty. So it will change. And it's interesting because we do notice that as well, a bit like you were saying about children. We do notice as children grow and develop, their general kinesthetic awareness and proprioception improves, right? We look less, most of us, like Bambi on ice when we're a little bit older. We have a little bit more movement and body awareness. That can obviously depend on lots of influencing factors. What sports and activities did you engage in when you were a child? Did you have lots of outdoor multi-direction, change of direction coordination sports? Because that's going to increase your development of proprioceptive skill base. So that was something I was going to throw in when you were saying earlier about seeing those riders, is we almost want to know their proprioceptive age. If someone's been relatively sedentary through their school life, not being a particularly active person, and then they've had an office-based job and they've never been a particularly sporty person, and they had underlying joint hypermobility, and then they start cycling or another sport, their proprioceptive age, we talk a lot about training age. You're familiar with that, sort of the idea of training age or cycling age. Yeah. But their proprioceptive age, if you want to use that term, is very, very low. Their base is very low. And if you add to that some hypermobility, they'll have a really tough time. So that history of understanding the person can tell you a lot about how you can manage your expectations as a fitter for what they might be like on the bike.
Yeah, totally agree about just looking for that kind of history. Certainly we put out a really comprehensive pre-screening questionnaire as someone books in and so on. So we're already kind of researching stuff before they come into the studio. But almost had exactly this case you were just saying about athletic maturity or joint maturity. Someone who's come to sport kind of later on in life, and I had this guy who came in and literally just been super sedentary until 2 years ago, until the pandemic, and he's 20 odd years of age, and then suddenly was able to get out and do sport, and he was incredibly mobile but had never really learnt how to control his joints, and was getting all kinds of issues certainly with running. So he was a triathlete, wanted to be a triathlete, and all his issues were about kind of controlling his movement as he was landing, and just the joint stability and strength to control all those movements, which was really interesting. But he found cycling strangely difficult as well, just because it felt like a very unnatural kind of movement pattern for him to do, whereas swimming for him was like really natural. He felt
that's
like
interesting. And that's, I would say, just to jump in there, that's actually contrary to what we would generally see in this population, whereby providing external constraint and stimulus can normally help a hypermobile individual because it gives them some grounding points. On the one hand. So generally speaking, that can be helpful, but it depends where those grounding points are. So if they're really out of range, then it can just really throw them. But if they're in a reasonable position, and this is where the importance of bike fit comes in for hypermobile individuals, it can be really helpful because they have ground contact and reference points. I've often found that swimmers with hypermobility can have more difficulty, particularly because that high shoulder range requirement there. There's a lot of challenges. But building up and having good swimming coaching can be incredibly empowering. And we'll come on to some of the things that we look at to help people with hypermobility, particularly those who have issues associated with it. But perhaps your individual felt that being in the pool helped him have some joint support, and then he was able to use his muscles, and there was a less of a cue to lock out his joints. So, this is where the individuality of the human experience and the human condition is sort of boundless, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fascinating, and this is what's so interesting about seeing people every day. You just see different people all the time, and their different requirements and so on. And I haven't seen someone like that for quite a while. And I think you're right. Probably being in the pool, surrounded by water, I think he actually felt more kind of held by the water, you could feel there was something around him all the time. So maybe that was enough to give him that sense of security in there. But yeah, let's get into what we want to see within our bike fitting. And so we've talked about what hypermobility is, but how can it affect our bike riding, and what are the consequences of how people operate on the bike. Talked a little bit about some of the things that I've seen. I don't know if you want to expand a little bit more about kind of some of the symptoms you see within your bike riders, what they deal with.
So, in general, there's two. Well, there's a few parts, but primary part is that control and awareness. So, what I refer to as kinesthetic awareness, we just term that as proprioception. So that is that individual's awareness of tissue stretch. They have a lower threshold awareness of tissue stretch and range of motion. So you'll often see that really contradictory presentation of those who are hypermobile really liking to stretch or wanting to stretch. And that is because they don't feel stretch within what they consider their normal range of motion. So they have a extremely high range of motion. They are toward the end of their anatomical capacity, further than most of the population will be able to reach into the available anatomical range. But they'll push beyond that until they feel stretch, almost to get that sort of, okay, I'm at that reassurance that I'm at the end of range. Yeah. So you've got to be aware that often a hypermobile individual will want or need, and I almost say that in inverted commas, to have that feeling of stretch, because that gives them feedback. And that is a difficulty, because stretch is not really something we want in many areas or elements of our bike setup. So that can sometimes cause that rider to feel all at sea, because they think nothing's on stretch, I have no information. And that's where, as I said, sometimes those riders where they just feel a bit lost on the bike because nothing's stretching, which means there's no sensory, almost like no sensory information coming back. Yeah. So that's that one sort of area of problems that I see, and perhaps a little bit more of within a hypermobile population. The other is a higher propensity towards compression-related pains. And that goes along with this change again in connective tissue, where nerves and blood vessels are more prone to compression. So our compression neuropathies or ischemic type pressure pain. So at the contact point, so hands on handlebars, on the saddle, and in our shoes and feet. So with that additional stretch and pliability, there is the increased possibility that there's going to be compression of those tissues, and they just don't tolerate with it as well. So I tend to find that in those cases, there is often a role actually for a seat that they find comfortable, but with gel, or those gel inserts underneath bar tape, just to provide that little bit of extra compliance that I wouldn't perhaps consider in other situations. So there's that side of thinking about that soft tissue and that sort of change. And then finally, I guess the other part is, and this is again very individual, is the strength. There will often be a relatively weaker population. That's unfair. I'm really probably doing too much tarring, but generally in my experience, I would see that strength is often a little bit of an issue. Again, this depends a lot on their training age, their training history, their sport and athletic exposure over their lifetime. But in general, I will often see that there are strength challenges alongside that. And of course, if you combine a great ability to reach end of range with not great strength, it's very hard to provide structural support for your skeleton at end range with weaker muscles. And it's a little bit of a sort of almost like a perfect storm of problems coming together. That feeling of, I can reach this position, but I'm not very strong here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so trying to bring all those things together.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and in very general terms, again, I think I see the same thing. I think a lot of people will always trend towards their superpowers. You know, if you naturally feel like you have the ability to get into these different postures very easily, to be able to reach that end stretch very easily, you may trend towards those kind of activities that demand those kind of postures. You know,
Oh,
you might
absolutely.
do
Self-selection bias is
yeah.
a thing, right? Big people might think, I'll play rugby. Flexible people think, I'll do yoga.
Yeah.
Because I'm straight away at an advantage, and it makes total sense. So, yeah, I think why wouldn't you do that? Cycling's got an interesting one, and this is perhaps another angle to unpick, which is two things. One is working towards your superpower, as you phrased it, which is cool. As a cool way to look at it, is that obviously one of the elements of cycling and cycling performance is aerodynamics, and this can be a dangerous one because you can end up, dangerous is too strong a word, it can be a challenging one because a rider who has great or high flexibility or hypermobility has a high propensity towards being able to achieve a very aerodynamically efficient position from a frontal area. So being able to really fold those hips forward, being able to get that spine very flat. But that can be at great cost to that athlete. And this is where you need to be considerate of those joint ranges. If you're fitting a hypermobile athlete who then also has a competitive goal of wanting to be aerodynamic, you will find that you could put them in an extremely aggressive position, but you really need to think wisely about all of the other consequences of that positioning on that rider's body. So that's just one thing I wanted to point out, because when we talked about the superpowers that we have and what sports we choose, having a high propensity towards flexibility and wanting to be aerodynamic, that's like, oh, perfect. That's the perfect combination, but it can come at a cost when you are not just very flexible, you're hypermobile.
Yeah.
So something to be aware of, I think.
Yeah. Let's dig into a little bit about strength then, because it's almost the other end of the spectrum for mobility is strength, and I guess I've definitely seen like really kind of muscular guys with hypermobility, and usually again they don't really have any idea that that was a thing. And quite often, again, it lends itself to certain kind of sports like Olympic lifting. You need like amazing amounts of mobility as well as strength at the same time. So they're really interesting kind of people to fit. But I guess the way in which people seem to be able to control the hypermobility within their joints is to have enough strength to control the certain positions. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be like kind of stacked, but you just have that, I guess, activation of muscle groups and neuromuscular pathways to kind of make sure that joint moves in the way that you want it to.
Yeah,
Would you say that's
look,
fair?
strength is a really important activity to perform for all human beings, and I'm a big proponent of it within my bike fits and my physio practice. So, separate to that, if you look at any of the research towards sort of active management of hypermobility, strength training will always crop up alongside Pilates as being really positive things to do if they're well structured and well organized. So obviously the first caveat will be you do not want to be approaching and forcing into end of range with strength, particularly early on. So that's kind of really simple. But strength training has an amazing ability to load tissue. And of course, when you load tissue, you get a tissue response. And what we talked about with hypermobile individuals is that they often have a lower threshold tissue response and therefore awareness and that kinesthetic awareness and movement control. So using strength training as a mode to improve proprioceptive awareness and control, and also building that strength, because the muscles themselves will then provide additional support around those joints. And the more support there is around those joints, the less stress the underlying joint will endure during various activities. So that's where strength training really has its big role. Number one, it will improve the stability about a joint. And number two, it will improve that proprioceptive awareness and control through those active ranges. So while I do strength training and try to encourage it for all riders, in the case of an individual with hypermobility, it's so helpful, and the changes can be quite dramatic. And we know cycling is a predominantly, pretty much exclusively, concentric muscle contraction activity. In terms of the driving muscles, they're all shortening while they're contracting, and excluding the isometric and eccentric loading components is not a great idea in general health, and particularly at hypermobiles. So eccentric movements, which pretty much all strength training will involve, is super helpful to build up that sort of tissue resilience and tolerance and control. So again, I think if we can have strength training as part of the program, that's going to be really helpful. It just has to be added in gradually. Initially, I might even start someone with isometrics. If they're really struggling with movement control and awareness, we might start with isometrics, but absolutely working through to full range of motion exercises. You just have to watch how well the individual is able to cope with those movements and their execution. I'm a big believer in the body being extremely adaptive and responsive and able to tolerate lots of different positions. So technique can be really important, and all the same can be over-focused in so many individuals, where they get paralysis over a movement because they think, I didn't do my deadlift because I just wasn't sure I could do it right. I didn't get the technique right. And you think, actually, you know what? If you progressively load yourself in any movement, you can do it. Your body doesn't necessarily know what a perfect deadlift is. So, but with a hypermobile individual, they perhaps have a smaller tolerance for things working well versus not. So starting in mid-ranges and building out to those ranges, I will often just initially add support to an individual so that they can just perform the movement, feel the muscles loading, feel the joints moving, and then gradually make it harder from there. And weight bearing is really important. Engaging the feet is really important. We'll come back to that with bike fit. So in those cases, depending on their level of foot comfort or otherwise, if you can have someone in their socks or their bare feet, depending on what the training environment is, then that's great, because our feet are incredibly densely innervated structures and proprioceptive devices. They will give you lots of information. And if you can have someone's foot better engaged on the floor while doing weight training, that's going to have a positive sort of proprioceptive sensory input as well. So weight bearing, foot on the floor, if possible, a barefoot or a sock. Again, unless, caveat, there are conditions, foot problems, foot pain, etc. You may have to be aware of that, because as you know, when we put anyone's foot in a cycling shoe, it's a little bit of a sensory black box. And for hypermobility cases, that can be an even bigger issue, because we've just really reduced sensory input again.
And I was just about to get onto that, and as you were talking about it, just immediately went to kind of cycling shoes as this kind of box that really kind of locks your foot in. Everyone talks about, like, one of the things to kind of lock the foot, and it's very unnatural. The foot wants to be more mobile in our natural kind of gait. So again, cycling, a bit like skiing, I guess, is a strange activity for your body to have to kind of deal with. And added to that, you're locked into the handlebars, and the saddle is in a fixed position. There's, I guess, more limited amounts of movement choices that your body has within there. And so I guess that might prove to be a difficult situation for a hypermobile person to be in. And so just teaching them how to sit on the bike seems to be a really important part of the process. And as you were saying,
because they've got so many options.
They
can sit in so many different ways. They're like, I can lock my arms out. That's easiest. Back to your point about locking out, that is ultimately that individual searching for stability. What we want to do is we'd rather provide someone with stability through control, through their active structures rather than passive structures. And as you know, when you're riding a bike, if you ride with your arms locked out, you have a reduced control over the front of the bike, and you'll also more likely transmit forces into the wrist and up through the shoulder and neck. So, it's very easy to just tell someone who's hypermobile, oh, bend your elbows a bit. They are not going to do that. They will self-select to lock their arms out because it makes more sense to their body and their stability. But if you gradually add some training in and encourage the ability to support that, then you can start to see that changing. So there's a lot of those self-selections. And as you said, they've got such a range of pelvic positions that they might want to sit on and that they can sit on the bike, that is almost giving them a little bit of a guide. And I think starting off with that baseline of asking them what they can feel, what they are aware of. You know, that's almost like questioning again, what's their proprioceptive baseline? What are they aware of? And then where can we look to add some volume or some gain to that experience? So I think personally, starting at the feet is a really good place to go. And whether that's with just adding some footbeds to improve foot contact, foot interaction, and just the two things talking to each other is a really good place to start. You know, let's not get into too much detail about wedges and shims and heel wedges and inside shoe and outside shoe, but suffice to say, if you can increase the awareness of the foot and interaction with the shoe, generally speaking, that's going to be a really positive thing for the hypermobile rider to feel grounded.
Yeah.
And then we can start to work above from there. So for more than any other cases, the feet are a super important place to start with a hypermobile individual.
Yeah, and just like unfortunately, like what you were talking about earlier about them being particularly sensitive to certain proprioceptive areas, such as the foot and the arch. I find that like when I try to introduce some intervention into the shoes as well, it becomes really nuanced. They're really super sensitive, particularly to arch support, which is fairly firm. Yeah.
Got you.
I knew it as soon as I said it. But,
yeah. You thought I'd let it go.
Arch ticklers.
Arch contact.
Contact. Yeah. If you introduce quite firm arch contact to their shoe, that seems to be they're particularly sensitive to that.
Absolutely.
And yeah, it becomes quite tricky choosing the right amount of contact or sensation that you want to put into their proprioceptive joints. So
yeah, so I think in that instance, I think G8s are really good for that because it's quite a flexible arch piece. So that can be quite nice because it introduces a sort of a dynamic, slightly softer structure. I don't use G8s that often in my clinic nowadays, but for those cases, they can be really useful because they've got a really nice stable heel counter, but a flexible arch piece. And that what you experience there is the same thing as why I said sometimes there's a role for gel seats and gel bar tape inserts in the hypermobile, because the pressure, the contact pressure is something they're really sensitive to more than other individuals. That's not to say other people don't move into that spectrum, of course. There is overlap, but as a theme, I see that you've got to be sort of subtle with your interventions to try to achieve that. And exactly like you just said there, that sometimes they'll feel, wow, that's really quite firm. That's quite jarring. That's too much.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's got to be subtle, but I think starting there is a good way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you ever tried out Naboso insoles? They're like kind of insoles which are flat. There's no kind of raised arch or anything, but they have these proprioceptive
little prickles, kind of like the little kind of bubbles. They're almost like a shiatsu mat kind of thing.
Yeah.
Are they the ones that are in like the lower shoes?
Yeah.
I've never tried them out actually. No. I meant to reach out to John because obviously he's got a pair, but you've got a pair too. So no, I don't.
Yeah.
Experiences?
I'll send you a set if you want, and you can have a little play around with them.
Hey.
But I think they might be a little bit too much because the dimples are quite pronounced, and just even the majority of people that seem to put their feet into them are just like, whoa,
it's a sensory party.
Yeah, just overloading, like whoa. But the concept of it is really attractive to me, in that just finding ways of stimulating the body to a greater degree just by very small little interventions, and just those small changes in texture could make a big difference. Like I've seen certainly you just using kinesio tape across like kind of insoles in the past that have enough effect that people feel like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I can start to feel that now.
Finding that right intervention, that right level, and those more subtle things that someone else would just think, are you kidding? You've done nothing. But sometimes, I mean, often, a couple of layers of gaffer tape through the inside of a forefoot when a forefoot wedge is too much, And sometimes you can create that sort of, I can just feel something. And, it gets into the world of, have we changed anything or have we not? But if the rider feels a difference, there's a difference. And, if a tree falls in the wood and nobody was around to hear it, did it make a noise and all that kind of stuff? But, that exists. We can't quantify everything, and everything that's measured doesn't mean anything. I was going to say, down to that sort of stuff, I think being able to have feedback modalities for riders is really helpful. So I've got, as most physio clinics do, quite a few mirrors in the studio. And I think mirrors are often quite useful. People often don't like it. It's often the first thing they say when they get onto my platform. They think, I've never watched myself cycle. But actually, normally at some point during the session, they go, this is really helpful. I didn't really realize that my right shoulder was up around my ear, or that I lock out both my elbows. So mirrors can be useful. Cameras can also be helpful, because you can then show the rider where they were holding their body that they just weren't aware. So trying to layer pieces of information to improve that kinesthetic awareness, so they can layer up what they're feeling versus then what they can now see is going on. Saddle pressure mapping can also add to that picture of, if they're not aware of where their pressure is and how, when I do this, my pelvis rolls forward. So I think feedback is really useful. It can feedback about joint ranges, whether that's, like I said, at the pelvis, at the knee, at the foot. Like classically, you might see someone with a really big heel drop. In fact, I think you shared a video of some hypermobile individual who had a lot of heel drop because they just weren't aware of where their foot was moving in space. So exactly. You'll see cases of that with heel drop, elbow locking out, wrist extension. Those sort of patterns are sort of really common, and a rider being able to see it can be quite instructive and then empowering, and then can be the start of that journey of, okay, well, I think we need to change this. How can we start to change this? Some of it might be about component choice. That rider who's locking out their elbows and extending their wrists excessively might just be also on 42 centimeter handlebars, and she needs to be on 36 or 34, something like that, where it's just so far outside that she's self-selecting. The only way to be stable is to lock everything out. So bringing things within that realm, which is, that's simple. That's what we're trying to do when we're working on the bike, is we're just trying to help with bringing things within a range that they can gain some sort of control without feeling restricted. But sometimes that difficulty of the hypermobile individual looking for stretch, looking for feedback, looking for response can be a challenging one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you think you hit all the good points there. And shall we see if we can give our listeners some practical tips? Like what? We've talked quite a lot about what we should expect out of a hypermobile individual. I guess it may be fairly easy to kind of self-diagnose, or at least see if there's some localized joint hypermobility. If you look in the mirror and kind of lock out your joints and just check that way.
Certainly as a start point, it's very easy to self-administer a Baton scale or a Beighton scale. I really don't know which way to pronounce that, but it's a very easy to self-administer test and just see. Obviously, it's a 9-point scale that looks at, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, a couple of joints, and it may miss someone's hypermobility, or it may capture all of someone's hypermobility. So someone could have hypermobility at joints not tested. They may have hypermobility in their mid-thoracic, in their upper back, in their neck, or in their shoulders, much more so in their elbows. So you've tested their elbow extension, and their elbow extension is normal, but actually their shoulders are extremely hypermobile and they suffer regular dislocations and subluxations. So it's not a catch-all, but it's a really useful test as a screen. And that's kind of what we want to do, just give ourselves some information. So I think that's certainly something, if you think this could be me, maybe we could do a Baton scale. And I would encourage bike fitters, if they think that that's going on, to maybe just look at that and be aware. So that would be number one. And I guess I'm kind of trying to think of your listenership being a combination of bike fitters, people interested in cycling, and just cyclists. So a Baton scale could be something that bike fitters and an individual could do as sort of a start point to understand that a little bit more. If you do have hypermobility and you don't engage in any strength training, then it can be really beneficial. I also think Pilates, because it has such a focus on movement awareness and proprioceptive control, can be really, really helpful. For those that are struggling or potentially suffering with a more comprehensive connective tissue disorder, so multi-system issues, and I think we have to bear that in mind, is that a great degree of people who think they have joint hypermobility may have this stuff underlying. It can be quite impacting on life and lifestyle and activities, especially when it starts to feature things like gut and digestive disorders, chronic pain. There are lots of support networks and groups out there, like the Ehlers-Danlos Society is really helpful. Also, a Pilates instructor called Jeannie de Bon. She provides lots of really helpful information. She has an app. She does classes. She does one-to-ones, but she just has lots of really supportive information for a community. So if we're talking more about hypermobile EDS, just learning more about it and about pacing, about relaxation, because although we talk a lot about all this excessive movement, those at hypermobile often have lots of tension. They can feel tension in their upper back, and that can then lead to pain in the back. So relaxation techniques, breathing techniques, can find that really helpful. I often spend time actually working on breathing and relaxation techniques with riders who suffer with that mid-back tension, be they hypermobile or not. The link also between anxiety and hypermobile EDS is there. That's an unknown link as opposed to those with anxiety suffer more with HEDS or vice versa. But it's a highly prevalent link that those with HEDS have anxiety. And I think that's something to factor and feature into your bike fitting as well, in terms of how you communicate what you're going to do, because you can very easily, if you start telling someone they're unstable, you can trigger off a lot of fear, and they might think, oh my God, I don't feel safe on my bike. And what you want to do, alluding back to what you said earlier, is considering it like a superpower. I think we have to be careful with how we frame it, but we want to support that rider to be able to enjoy their bike, to feel safe on their bike, because that anxiety may drive a feeling of fear on the bike, and we want them to feel safe. So having the bike set up such that they feel in control can be extremely empowering to be able to enjoy riding. So I think really look to avoid putting people towards end ranges or in positions that encourage end range. So if a rider is stable, and this is just back to our sort of foundation principles, if a rider is stable on the bike, they are less likely to want to lock out joints to find stability. So that balance of your weight forwards and backwards is really important. Any rider, even without hypermobility, may be inclined to lock out their elbows if they're unstable, particularly forward on the bike. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So if we can get them more stable, we're going to reduce that cueing impulse to lock something out.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's in really simple terms, then it can be, you don't have to use your superpowers to control your body on the bike. There's so much there. I could keep talking all day, but I think it may be a good time to just kind of wrap things up. We've covered so many different topics in there. And I think last thing I just wanted to kind of touch on was, just our responsibilities as you called it, first contact practitioners. And as bike fitters, we do have the luxury of seeing a great range of different people, but it's also really important to stay in our lane.
Yes.
You have the luxury of being a bike fitter and a studio and a physio who's clinically trained, and a great amount of knowledge, so you can kind of go a little bit further into the clinical side of things. But certainly as a bike fitter who may not be clinically trained, then being very aware of kind of where that line is, and kind of even verbally where you overstep that line is a really important thing.
Yeah, that's key. And I can't remember whether we were starting to discuss that in pod attempt 1 or 2. I think it might have been in pod attempt 2. Yeah. But it's our role there as that first contact practitioner, it's a luxury but also a responsibility, as you said. And the key thing is to identify things, then decide whether it's appropriate for you to deal with it, suitable. Do you have the necessary skills? Whatever your background is, whether you're, like we said, coach bike fitter, mechanic bike fitter, clinical physio bike fitter, etc., decide whether you've got the skills to deal with or help that rider safely. And if not, hopefully you've built a network of people that you can contact, either as a sounding board or to refer to. I will link up with lots of different clinical practitioners and non-clinical practitioners to help me support the riders I work with. That might be sending them to a mechanic to do work on their bike that's beyond my skill. That might be sending them to a strength and conditioning coach to get more focused strength and conditioning work, or to a sports doctor to go through further investigations, or to their GP if we think there's some additional, like I said, whether we think we actually have a connective tissue disorder underlying that joint hypermobility, to bring it back to what we were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, don't be afraid of it if you're a bike fitter, but just be aware of it. And certainly as a rider too, I guess the idea of this podcast is to get you thinking about it, thinking whether or not it's something that's relevant to you. It
And
might,
cycling is an awesome activity for people with hypermobility in all cases.
Yeah.
It's relatively low impact. And that's one of the key recommendations with lots of hypermobility support groups is cycling is fantastic for hypermobility, but comes with considerations. And if you see an adequately trained bike fitter to work on that side of things to help your setup, it's absolutely brilliant. It is safe and it is brilliant to do, but comes with considerations.
Yeah. And so if you're not sure, go see your local bike fitter or search out someone who is aware and has some experience of these kinds of things. And you'll be able to find that kind of nice, comfortable ride you've always been looking for. So
I think reach out to a bike fitter. And if you are aware that you have hypermobility or connective tissue disorder and hypermobility with it, reach out to the fitter and ask them if they're comfortable to see you with that background. Do they feel comfortable with the knowledge to help set you up? And hopefully most bike fitters out there will be able to do that. But it's a good thing just to reach out first.
Good stuff. And on that note, where can people find you, Bryan? Where are you based? Tell us how we can find you on the grams, the socials, the websites,
all the usual awful social media platforms. I'm at the Bike the Body. I think is for all the various Instagram, Twitter, X, whatever it is these days. Thebikethebody.com is a website, or an email, info@thebikethebody.com. Are all the best ways to contact. I try to keep up with some social things and post some interesting cases and things like that, but it ebbs and flows.
Yeah, absolutely. We're all busy individuals seeing people day in, day out. So absolutely. So if you're in the kind of Bath area, give Bryan a shout. And thank you so much, Bryan. There's been so much insight there, lots and lots of knowledge, and really appreciate you sharing all of that with us.
That's been a pleasure.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get you on again.
That'll be fun.
All right. Cheers, Bryan. Thanks very much.
Cheers. Way. See you later.
If you made it to the end of this episode, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard, do leave us a rating or review, as this really helps other riders find our podcast too, and motivates us to keep making more episodes. Thanks for your support, and catch you on the next one.
Suffering from numb hands, tingling toes, and any other persistent discomforts when you ride? These are all signs that your bike fit could be improved. If you're bike fit curious, get in touch with Way or Matt by emailing info@foundation.fit or finding them on Instagram @FDN_bikefit. Finally, for all your bike servicing needs, custom dream bike or hand-built wheels, go to www.frequencycycleworks.com or find me on Instagram @frequencycycleworks. Until next time, keep on spinning.